that almost doubles the impact for us, because remember, the European tariff was only 2.2% anyway. So just by snapping your fingers, you get extra benefits there. In services industries, which are not as intensively traded between countries, they make an additional assumption. They assume that it becomes as easy to trade services like transportation, telecommunications, banking, business services, as easy to trade them between Canada and Europe as it is to trade them within Europe. So it'll be as easy as for a Canadian bank to set up in, say, the Netherlands and sell services there as it is for a German bank to set up in the Netherlands. In essence, they have assumed away the Atlantic Ocean, right? Never mind the distance, right, and that little thing called an ocean between us, let alone language and culture and history and structures that have to get built up to trade services. They just assume it will become in essence, that Canada will become part of Europe. Those two assumptions, bizarre as they are, account for another 30% of the gains, the $12 billion gains that were forecast. So we're in a ridiculous no-no land here, right? And we've still only accounted for 6 of the $12 billion gain. They had to make an additional third assumption in order to come up with a $12 billion estimate. And that is the assumption that any additional income that is earned in Canada, a portion of it will be saved. People will put it into their bank accounts, and then it will be invested in businesses in Canada. It can't be invested in businesses anywhere else. It can only be invested in Canada. And this is how they actually get another 50% of the benefits. So of the $12 billion, half of them come from this assumption that anyone who makes more money will save some of that money, and then through the stock market it will be productively invested in a Canadian business, which is nonsense, right? That isn't remotely what's happened. In fact, far from saving, the more consumers have earned in recent years, the more they've gone into debt. That's why Canadians owe 150% of their disposable income in debt. There isn't savings like that going on, and there certainly isn't investment in Canada. I would love to see it. Again, I'd vote for a measure which says all savings of Canadians have to be invested in Canada. I would love that. But that's not what, of course, a free trade agreement does. So these assumptions are bizarre, but necessary, because otherwise you wouldn't have the proof that free trade agreements will benefit. And in fact, this is not proof. A computer model like this is in essence a numerical toy that the economists love to play around with and simulate different scenarios and see what numbers they get, but it doesn't prove anything. Let's take a different approach. Let's abandon those ridiculous CGE assumptions. Let's describe current trade and employment patterns between Canada and Europe in detail. We'll apply escalation factors to that trade based on the elimination of tariffs and on historical evidence about how trade flows are likely to respond. And then we'll calculate the resulting impacts on bilateral trade flows, on jobs, and on GDP. Okay, we won't assume full employment. Okay, we won't assume a socialist utopia where all capital has to be invested in Canada, much as I would like one. We'll instead look at the real world. The initial data that we took for this alternative model included data on 23 different sectors of our economy, all the goods-producing sectors that trade between Canada and Europe. We looked at the actual 2009 trade data. The Canada-EU model did not do that. We look at sector-specific tariffs and consumer purchasing patterns and elasticities that are published. We also look at actual jobs in each sector that are available from Statistics Canada. Finally, here's a unique twist. We also looked at the history of Canada's other free trade agreements to see what could we learn from that history about what's likely to happen to exports and imports and jobs under a Canada-EU free trade agreement. So what did we get? First of all, in terms of learning from experience, there's some important information that we have to look at. Canada has already 5 free trade agreements that have been in place for several years. Those are with the United States and Mexico in the NAFTA, a free trade agreement with Israel, with Chile, and with Costa Rica. We've also signed a couple of smaller ones more recently with Panama and Peru and so on, but those ones have not had enough time to have a real impact yet. So we've looked at the 5 that have had an impact. What happened to our exports under those 5 free trade agreements? It turns out that our exports to the free trade partners grew by just under 5% per year after a free trade agreement. However, our exports to other countries that we didn't sign free trade agreements grew by more than 5% a year. So if our goal is to increase exports, and I actually think that is a good goal for Canada, signing a free trade agreement is not the way to do it. Our experience with free trade agreements is actually negative. Same is true on the import side, okay? After a free trade agreement was signed, our imports from free trade partners grew at about 9% a year. Our imports from other countries that we hadn't signed free trade with grew only at about 7%. So in every case, our trade balance performed worse with the free trade partners than it did with countries we didn't have a free trade agreement with. If we want to promote exports and promote a stronger trade balance, signing a free trade agreement is exactly the wrong way to do it. And we'll take advantage of that historical information in designing our model, which looks at 3 scenarios. We considered 3 cases that we look at with our number crunching. First is when the 2 sides simply eliminate their tariffs, okay? And then we apply an escalation factor based on consumer elasticities. The second approach is where we directly apply the experience of our 5 previous free trade agreements to the European case and say, what if the European case exactly mirrors what happened with our other free trade agreements? The third case is where we now consider the impact of the rising Canadian dollar on our trade flows. The fact that the dollar has gone up by about 19% against the euro since the 2 sides started negotiating. What is that going to mean for our trade flows with Europe, as well as the impact of tariff elimination? Those are the 3 scenarios that we considered on the basis of real-world data, not CGE models. And this table that you'll see considers the impacts of those 3 scenarios, looking at the impact on our trade balance, on employment, and on Canadian GDP. The simplest one was just the elimination of tariffs on both sides. That leads to a deterioration in our trade balance of $8.5 billion. That, remember, is consistent with what the government's own study projected. The loss of 28,000 jobs. Why do we lose jobs? Well, we do have some increase in exports to Europe. That creates jobs. But we have a larger increase in imports from Europe. That destroys a larger number of jobs. And the net impact is minus 28,000. And that translates into a loss of about half a percentage point of Canadian GDP. If we look at the experience of our 5 other free trade agreements and extrapolate that to the European case, the numbers are a bit worse. We're looking at about a $14 billion increase in our trade deficit, the loss of 46,000 jobs, and the loss of close to a full percentage point of Canadian GDP. The worst case scenario, though, is when we consider the impact of that 19% rise in our dollar, because now even our exports to Europe might fall, even though we sign a free trade agreement, because the 19% damage done by the higher dollar more than offsets the 2% opening that we get as a result of the free trade agreement, if you follow me. Under that scenario, we look at a $45 billion increase in our bilateral trade deficit with Europe. Devastating. 150,000 lost jobs in Canada and a 3% reduction, experienced over several years, not overnight, but after the adjustment is completed, a significant reduction in our GDP. These numbers are negative. I don't know which scenario is going to pan out. I do know there's almost no real-world circumstance under which you can reasonably predict that free trade with Europe will actually lead to increased jobs and improved trade balance for Canada without imposing those ridiculous assumptions of a CGE model. We have to abandon that old idea that just having free trade and free markets and free business will make sure that our economy operates at its potential and ensures our prosperity. That kind of trickle-down logic, right? It hasn't worked for Canada. What did work was when we had proactive strategies, what I call integrated industrial and trade strategies, by our governments, working in partnership with companies and with unions and with universities to develop key high-tech innovative industries and make sure that Canada has a share of them. The Auto Pact is an example. That's how come we have an auto industry here. The aerospace industry also has benefited from proactive strategies like that. Telecom, other high-value industries that we have always benefited from governments getting involved and developing those sectors and making sure that Canada gets our share. We can learn from other countries in the world as well. Finland doesn't export raw trees like we do, even though they've got a lot of trees. They export expensive finished wood products. They also export a lot of high-tech telecommunications equipment. Korea doesn't just trust free trade. They act proactively to protect their home market, okay, make sure that their industrial companies, whether it's Hyundai or Samsung, are strong, and then use that home market as a platform to go out into the world with successful exports. Germany doesn't trust free trade. Germany has a whole set of proactive policies where you have government, training institutions, companies, and unions working together to develop high technology exports, and Germany is the most successful exporter in the world. Those are the sorts of policies that we should be imitating. A free trade agreement won't do it. We do need trade. I'm all in favor of more trade and building Canada's exports, but free trade is not really about trade. Free trade is about a set of rules that benefits companies but won't actually benefit our economy. The full study that has all the details of the talk that we've just completed is called Out of Equilibrium. You can download the full study at the site of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is policyalternatives.ca. And I thank you very much for your attention. Now let's go out and stop that free trade deal. Thank you.